Hello and welcome to session 244 in the AISafety.com reading group. Tonight we'll be discussing the first part of the article Democratizing Risk in Search of a Methodology to Study Existential Risk by Carlos O. Creamer and Luke Kemp. Carlos O. Creamer works at the Future of Humanity Institute and Luke Kemp at the Center for Study of Existential Risk. This article is a couple of months old, and we'll only be talking about the first third of this article tonight. Hopefully we'll be able to cover the entire rest next time, otherwise perhaps we'll have to split it into a couple of more sections. First, I would like to say thank you to the authors for critically examining the arguments for what we do. I honestly believe that it's really important to get critical views on both AI safety and existential risk work in general, because this is an area where it's just very difficult for a person to be able to explore both sides of the story, and that's why I believe it's very valuable that other people are taking the time, even whether they do it as like red teaming or because they sincerely believe that there are problems. I believe it's really valuable. And of course, since I'm summarizing something that I don't necessarily agree with, that means that the summary, when I summarize things, I omit a lot of qualifiers and things, and that might make it somewhat strawmanish, and I apologize for that. Also, at the time where I was writing this, there was a story that Russia had placed the strategic nuclear forces on high alert, and meticulous gave 1 in 20 probability of people dying in nuclear explosions. That obviously biased me a bit more towards more immediate short-term considerations with regards to existential risks. And finally, if the authors or anyone else see this, they will notice that I'm extremely critical. I am very critical with all the texts. Last week we have some rather good work from Anthropic that I also engaged very critically with. So it's not just this. So the first argument being presented is regards to the standards of research in existential risk studies. And it's argued that it should be held to a high standard. And this can be interpreted in multiple ways. There is the simple saying that we want the research to be of high quality. I certainly believe it should be, and I think just about everybody would want that. But standards doesn't actually mean that. One of the ways we probably should analyze standards is regards to how much do we put in. And from the public side, the funding for existential research, for research into existential risk, is extremely low. And that should affect our standards. Like if we imagine that you cut the budgets for the hospitals with 50%, then the standard of care you would expect would be much lower. So in this way, it's not entirely clear whether they're just talking about the quality or they are talking about the standards. And the arguments given for requiring high standards are threefold. First, it's an ambitious field. It could affect the lives of many. And finally, it affects scholars who want to change the trajectory of global society. And this, to me, seems to be mixing the two in that affecting the lives of many. That's the argument for high quality, basically. And the other two perhaps could be construed as related to the standards, but it's somewhat more confusing to me, at least. Perhaps some of the same confusion happens when we talk about the challenges that existential risk studies faces. We start out with how can it be inclusive of all our preferences and visions of the future, and of course that's something that in alignment research in particular has been studied and discussed very extensively, like on a bit more on the object level, like how can we make a superintelligence that's aligned with our coherent extrapolated volition or whatever. And another challenge is avoid baking in subjective assumptions into our analysis, and that's something that I think researchers in general can't avoid. Making this kind of analysis completely objective is probably too high a bar, and probably not really a desirable way in order to get the best possible estimates. Then how there's the argument that it will affect people who don't share the values of the researchers. Well, existential risks are of course unique in that they affect everyone in a very direct way. So again, we are seeing somewhat of a difference between the subject and the object and the meta level. Three other considerations also make this clear. How will researchers conduct complex risk assessments, deal with uncertainty and different levels of plausibility and evidence, and this kind of thing. And this is when I read this text, I become in doubt because on the object level, people who are working with trying to forecast AI timelines or something like that, they obviously need to deal with uncertainty, and that's like the core thing, the object thing that they are actually working on. It is also possible to state that existential risk studies as a field needs to have special ways, special meta practices around this that they for some reason need in addition to these object level considerations. But if that is what our authors are trying to say, then we need some kind of reason, like why is this in particular a requirement for existential risk studies and not for like cancer research and whatever. Another perhaps more interesting issue is we want to ensure that the studies isn't misused for dangerous actions. In AI risk, the classic dangerous action is the two progress bars of model of capability and alignment research, and where it's well known that there is a substantial overlap between the two. In general, ensuring no misuse is super hard. One challenge that the authors don't mention is, of course, the central challenge, and that is to reduce the risk of existential catastrophe. And I think that it would probably have been wise of the authors, for reasons I'll show later, to be much more explicit at this point. It is indeed possible that there is some kind of trade-off between to what level the risk is democratized and to what level it is the risk is just lowered. Perhaps we'll get to that later, but it was not in the first 3 chapters. We will instead talk about the techno-utopian approach. The techno-utopian approach is based on 3 pillars of belief: transhumanism, total utilitarianism, and strong long-termism. Now, I think I need to clarify one thing. Again, it's possible that I've totally misunderstood this, but when the authors use the word approach, I think the word that they are actually meaning to use is argument. Like, this is an argument why extinction is bad. And so the techno-utopian argument against existential risk is that at some kind of technological maturity, we could have a huge amount of utilitarian value. And if we don't get that, then that's almost as bad, or potentially is, an existential catastrophe. And so we have a really strong moral obligation to ensure that we get to this techno-utopian future, even through exceptional actions. And in this case, as if this is an argument against existential risk, then it is just one of many. I think there are many possible ways to argue against extinction. Like, you could argue that people's preferences are being violated and things like that. So this is one argument among many. But it is special in the sense that existential risk studies originated in people who were talking about the techno-utopian approach. And that's actually somewhat odd. I noticed I'm a bit confused. Like, why don't other moral philosophies call out and explicitly say, hey, we should really ensure that the long-term future ends up in a nice place? Because, as the authors point out, this is something that kind of came about in a strange way, where people were exploring the techno-utopian approach, and from that realizing that it was very important to look into existential risks, and then of course figuring out that there were substantial problems. But it, I think at this point, to me at least, the origin of the field is of questionable importance. I'm not saying it is of no importance. It's just that the burden of proof lies squarely on the authors to show that there is a problem, because in general, shooting the messenger afterwards isn't really relevant. Like, one analogy I just came up with is that there is some astrologer who might be crazy, might be not, might have other moral failings, but he tells you to look up, and you look up and there's a meteor heading for you. And so if that happens, then the goal should be to deflect the meteor, and whether that astrologer is actually crazy or in the outgroup or has evil or whatever, that doesn't matter very much. The focus is on the asteroid coming for us, right? So for me personally, I don't care very much about this argument against existential risk. But I think in the interest of this, getting into this, I expect that I will be defending this techno-utopian approach somewhat more than what I actually truly believe. Also, with regards to the origin, later in the article, Toby Ord is actually quoted as saying that other value systems, ethical, meta-ethical theories can be used to argue that extinction is bad, and I agree that, but it's still strange that the utilitarian Toby Ord is saying this, and not like Aristotle. Like, if virtue ethics implies that it's important to avoid extinction, you would expect someone else to have figured that out over the past 2,000 years. So what are the arguments for focusing on the techno-utopian approach? The authors argue that it is by far the most influential approach or argument within this field. Unfortunately, they don't really present any arguments for this. So from my personal intuition, which might as well be good, I think if you ask, especially as you get closer to the object level, you will find people who don't really care that much about ethics. Like, why is nuclear weapons bad? If you ask someone involved in disarmament why nuclear apocalypse is bad, they might not have a good answer for you. Excuse me. Some people will probably try and make an argument based on like altruistic considerations, and some people might also argue plain self-preservation, which I think is a perfectly fine argument for trying to avoid extinction. The problem is the moral values in the techno-utopian approach might be embedded in the analysis, and that could be problematic to me, certainly if it means the analysis suffers from it. And the authors argue that they will later, not today unfortunately, but in the later part, they will show examples where the techno-utopian approach leads to conclusions which in fact increase catastrophic risk, and that would of course be really bad. And I really like if this is called out. Let's go back to the definition of existential risk. Here I found Bostrom's original definition of an existential risk, one that threatens the premature extinction of Earth originating intelligent life, or the permanent and drastic destruction of its potential for desirable future development. The bolding is in the original. This is described by the authors as a techno-utopian definition. So of the three pillars, total utilitarianism, as far as I can tell, there is no total utilitarianism here. There is perhaps a bit of transhumanism in that there's an Earth originating intelligent life, there is perhaps a bit of long-termism if you really squint about desirable future development, but calling this techno-utopian is, to me, really, really questionable. It's yeah. So one of the things the authors argue is that there are no other definitions than this, at least not in widespread use, and I think that's true. But I also think that a lot of the practitioners of the field, just in practice, take the first half of the definition, like the bolded part, and then they perhaps replace Earth originating intelligent life with humanity. So existential risk is ones that threatens the premature extinction of humanity. At least I think that's how people do. I don't actually know. The authors make some rather strong claims about how this is embedded, including that it characterizes almost every existential risk text with significant public profile. I think that is, depending on precisely what it means, that the argument characterizes, that seems rather wrong. One of the examples that I think people would expect to do this would be the book Superintelligence by Nick Bostrom, which does include this argument against existential risk, but hidden away in chapter 6 and put inside one of these boxes that Bostrom used to say that like this is optional reading and not really necessary for the argument to carry. There's also an argument, it's also claimed that there exist people in existential risk study who subscribes to this techno-utopian approach. And I think it is certainly clear without any doubt that there are people who accept this argument. But the authors don't actually claim that it's the primary argument. And I mean, that should be possible to find out, right? You could literally ask Bostrom, do you feel existential risk is most bad because people die, or because then we can't have this glorious future? So moving on a bit more with the definition, if we take the last part of the definition, which I think is the one that Carla and Luke are really attacking, like the permanent and drastic destruction of humanity's potential for desirable future development. They claim this as an example of something that would be covered by the existential risk definition. Humans persist sustainably and equitably for the next billion years without major technological progress. Now, on the face of it, that sounds desirable. So by definition, if it's something that means we can't have a desirable future, then by this definition, it's not really covered. The word desirable does indeed imply values. And the classic thing, like desirable can mean different things, but the thing that it could mean is that the people who are there are happy to be there. Is it possible that there is something in this definition that isn't really covered? Like, is it possible, for instance, you could have like ecologically aware living, sustainable and equitable, like communism, but without the desirable part? I think it is possible. It is possible to have, in theory, to think that you could have a society, like if you are a utilitarian, I am a utilitarian, and then whether it's desirable as a society, depending on like are the people there happy, seems to me almost like an axiom. But I recognize that for most people are not utilitarians, right? So something like that might indeed be what people want. To give an extreme example, someone like Pol Pot would be one who would be happy with an ecologically aware, undesirable communist society. And I think that that's of course a very extreme example, but I think there are a number of people, like most people are utilitarians, right? So there must be a lot of people for whom the ethics aren't really based on people being happy. I think in practice, however, that the reasons why the reasons for the destruction of the potential of humanity is almost certainly going to be something that is really bad. I think what Bostrom is thinking about is like something that kills almost everyone, destroys the planet, or in particular stable authoritarianism, is like the thing that he's worried about. And of these things, like total destruction of the total ecological catastrophe and stable authoritarianism, these kind of things seem really, really bad for me. So I'm happy to include it as an existential risk, but I recognize that we are making a valid judgment here. The next complaint is on transhumanism, that there is value in exploring post-human and transhuman modes of being. Bostrom has, there's a quote from Bostrom here, that if we can't do this, that may itself constitute an existential catastrophe. So Bostrom is using the word may, and the authors are concluding from this that preventing existential risk is not primarily about preventing the suffering and termination of existential, but it's focused on trying to get to this techno-utopian. I think it's just plainly a much too sharp conclusion. You can't really, from Bostrom's carefully may, conclude that this is what it's primarily about, right? There are many reasons why extinction is bad. Strong long-termism is the thought that the values, the value of the long term can and often, to an extreme degree, will overshadow the values right here and now. And it's argued that it doesn't give any clear guidance on when we should prioritize the living humans of today. And I think it does, in fact. It does give it, we should prioritize humans today to the extent that this helps us in the long term, which in practice almost always will, right? And in particular, it's very easy to find principled guidance from consequentialist utilitarians. It's a lot harder to be a perfect consequential utilitarianist, but they certainly know what to do, right? You just calculate. So, yeah, here's the definition of long-termism. That might be an ethical imperative to select the choices that will have the best effect on the long-term future. And that's often reducing existential risk, but there are some underlying assumptions. Three are mentioned here: that we will have continued technological development, that will settle the stars eventually, and that the future people will be happy. I think the full techno-utopian approach assumes all three, but just strong long-termism this doesn't really matter that much. The key thing is, will people in the future be happy? And that's something that needs to be investigated, that has been investigated a little and should be investigated more, because it is in fact rather important. The extent to which this is settled is called into question by the authors. Cite three words: one, what's wrong with human extinction, on the survival of humanity, and on becoming extinct. Now, I haven't read those, but to the extent that they call into question whether or not extinction is bad, I would claim that it's an extremely niche view, and that it is just plainly accepted among just about everyone that extinction is bad, period. Representation. The techno-utopian argument is not representative, like, at all of what humans right now believe. That doesn't necessarily say whether it's right or wrong, or perhaps it does actually. According to Bayesianism, we would expect it to have at least some evidence. The authors claim recently that it's risky to rely exclusively on one unrepresentative approach, and it would be, but it's not true that existential risk studies relies exclusively on this argument. Like, there are some people who believe it, but relies exclusively is way, way, way too strong. They also suggest instead we should have empirical studies on what are human intuitions on extinction. I mean, it's possible that there indeed exists a large amount of people who would be happy about existential risk, but we need, before we call for like a lot of opinion polls or something like that, we need to have some kind of intuition. Like my right now, my intuition is that almost everybody would prefer that there not be nuclear war, and we need some kind of argument, some kind of polls must have been made somewhere for the authors to say that this is something that needs to be investigated in more detail. They do try to argue that it's not that the techno-utopian approach is not representative. Here is the World Transhumanist Association in 2007 was 90% male and had a median age of 30 to 33 years old. I actually think it's way less representative than this, and I'm surprised that the authors couldn't find better arguments. Like the median age is 33, that could describe like literally everything, right? But I do actually believe that it is not representative, and depending on how you ask, you could get at least total utilitarianism is something that you can ask in your opinion polls, and people will often say it's a good idea, but depending on precisely how you ask, it could also be a bad idea. I think the reason why people don't give consistent answers in opinion polls is just that they haven't thought a lot about it. But I want to emphasize here that I accept and I believe that the techno-utopian argument is very fringe in humanity at large. Another, perhaps more serious charge against existential risk studies is that of elitism, which is claimed to be an elitist field. And the definition of elitist is that the researchers and champions are granted decision-making powers in society. I will claim that it is that the people like Bostrom and Swiatkowski are indeed not granted decision-making power in our current society. But that leads into what Scott Alexander has called a bravery debate, where everybody is saying that they are like very brave people standing up to the other people who are in fact the decision makers. And that doesn't really, I mean, it's just a poor way of arguing, and I would like to avoid getting into that. It's true, depending on, like, if you're literally pro extinction, then yeah, you might be brave to stand up to the anti-extinction people and feel like the anti-extinction people are controlling the debate, at least. But to go from there to say that these people are decision makers is clearly too far. And I think the authors also don't make the strongest version of that argument, in that they are more like scholars, but still claiming that they are rapidly and intentionally growing in influence. And to argue for this, they have a few examples of some politicians who pay lip service and say, oh yeah, that's existential risk, and then nothing more. And I think to show that they have any kind of influence in society, you need to do way, way more. They're clustered in elite universities, and then there is an argument here that existential risk studies is 4 steps removed from neoliberalism, in that existential risk studies is, according to the authors, very influenced by the techno-utopian approach, which is again related to something they call the Californian ideology, which is related to neoliberalism. And I must admit, I've never heard about Californian ideology. Like, to me, this is it can't be that pervasive a cultural thing, if I've never heard about it. I think it is in practice, in order to go that way, you need to go like one more step to say the techno-utopian approach is related to Silicon Valley, is related to capitalism, is related to neoliberalism. But this is a really, really bad argument, right? With like 5 steps of separation, you can literally, I believe you can connect anything to anything. And the authors don't even argue why neoliberalism is bad. They just use it as an applause slide. I think this is really a really poor argument, unfortunately. What are the risks of this non-representative view? Well, granting influence to of potentially of our future to a tiny minority is problematic. And I would agree if this what we were doing, if we were giving influence of humanity to Nick Bostrom, that would be something we should think about. But it's not like we are granting him influence. He's just basically writing some stuff and seeing who is writing, and almost no one else is thinking about this. If we try to implement policies that reduce existential risk, well, then there might be other interests that are overshadowed. And this would be true indeed if Nick Bostrom was implementing policy, but he's not implementing policy. The people who are implementing policy are not considering existential risk at all. And again, the people who decide what risks we should take and what risks we shouldn't take is probably narrow right now. And I agree it's probably narrow, but again, the people who are actively deciding whether we should build more nuclear weapons do not include Eliezer Yudkowsky. And finally, one of the things that people working within the techno-utopian approach have been writing about is moral uncertainty. And that is something that the authors think is really good and should continue, and I also think it's good. So I want to end on a positive note. That is all for today. Thank you and see you next week.